okay. So yeah, he's like promoting sumo, trying to get people to come in and try it. There's all these stories about, practices, preparing for tournaments and things like that. And then in early 1937, the Beikoku Sumo Kyokai, that's the American Sumo Federation or Association, decides to do a thing that was happening a lot just generally within the Nikkei community at the time, but also the Japanese, from the Japanese side too, in Japan, was a kengakudan. These are like study tours or like extended field trips of weeks or months. Hello, and welcome to Echoes, a sumo history podcast. I am Nathan, and I will, to create like a weird San Diego sandwich, have Jake introduce himself.
San Diego sandwich. What would be on the San Diego sandwich?
We put torta as avocado.
Avocado, French fries.
Yes,
okay.
Yes. And a French baguette made by a Vietnamese baker.
Yes. And then maybe a fish taco like inserted in it because San Diego.
That sounds deliciously multicultural. I love it.
Yeah.
I would eat the San Diego sandwich. I'm Jake of Grand Sumo Breakdown and Iowa Sumo Club. And I'm excited for part 2 of our main character here.
Yes. And I like to do this from this particular spot. I am
it did feel
JJ
weird
Jones.
Being in a different spot, didn't it?
It felt real strange. And I am the luckiest guy ever because I surround myself with greatness. See, I need it just for that.
Oh, okay. That's fine.
It's not a San Diego sandwich anymore.
JJ Jones.
All right. Well, thank you. So I already said my name, but I've, the main researcher for this project. I have a lot of people helping, and actually this one I got a lot of help from somebody. So we'll talk about that a little bit. So a couple things for our listeners and watchers of this, viewers of this is one, this is part 2 of the story of a guy named Hiroshi Bud Mukaye. So this is part 2. And so it's a continuation. It'll make more sense if you have listened to part 1. And the other thing is we're going to have a companion episode with an expert that we interviewed that should be up soon or already up, depending on how time travel works. With Jim McNaughton, who's a guy who wrote a book and provided a lot of expertise and actually helped me out with a bunch of research on this episode. So that was a cool interview, and we'll be posting that up too.
Hey everyone, JJ here from the Echo Chamber. This episode, the nonprofit that we're working with is the National Veterans Network. There's a lot of amazing information here about Japanese people, and especially the ones that decided to donate and volunteer their time for the military during World War II, which in itself is an amazing story. I'm sure you guys have already seen that we've had an interview with Jim McNaughton. If not, that'll come out soon. But please donate to them. They have so much information. They do so much for awareness of Japanese people during that time. Again, if you cannot afford it, I understand. Just go through there and at least get the information. If you have a couple extra dollars, go ahead and donate to them. I will drop the information somewhere on the bottom here. Thank you. And let's continue the show. Bye-bye now.
So, Bud Mukaye. Last time we left off, with him in assembly center camps and then in World War II concentration camps where all West Coast Nikkei, Japanese Americans, were placed. And this happened in the spring of 1942. And first he went to the Santa Anita Assembly Center, which is racetrack and fairgrounds, and it was turned into an assembly center where like about 10,000 Japanese Americans from Southern California were assembled. And so Bud Mukaye was there. And before I kind of move on to the next story, one thing I wanted to kind of talk about, JJ, could you pull up the next slide?
Of course.
Is that while Bud Mukaye was at Santa Anita, there was this detail I actually just got recently from Jim McNaughton, who we interviewed, but this is a cool connection, is that when Bud Mukaye was there, he was training people, and one of the people he was training was a guy named Hank Ogawa. Have you ever heard of him, JJ?
I have not.
Okay. So he was from Bainbridge Island, Washington, but he founded a judo club in like Ontario, Oregon, Caldwell, Idaho, right on the border. And I don't know much about like judo history, but that's where the U.S. Judo Federation is based.
Interesting.
So I don't know judo politics, and actually, like Jake, I think your wife is also big into judo, but
far from being involved in like a national federation or anything.
Okay,
More like college hobbyist. But JJ, okay. Yeah, like that's for people less familiar. You are very extensively experienced in judo.
Yeah, and so the judo federations are there's 3 different ones, which makes it a little bit complicated. And I am a longtime member of the United States, not the Federation, but the United States Judo Association.
Okay. All right.
And then the Federation is their competitor, but then they all kind of get together and work with each other for USA Judo, which it's all complicated. But I'm on the other side.
Okay. So the reason like I thought this was like really interesting is this guy, Hank Ogawa, lived in Bainbridge Island, Washington. And that's where he was born. He's a year younger than Bud Mukaye. And he ended up at the Santa Anita Assembly Center, which is unusual. I think he was down here for school, but he was a semi-pro football player for the Seattle, like a team in Seattle. And he went to the Kodokan in Japan to study judo. And then post-war, he ended up settling in Eastern Oregon, Western Idaho, and starting a judo club. And then, I mean, based on the fact that the, U.S. Judo Federation is based there, he must have some kind of juice. And then also a weird lasting legacy, and this is just another one of those weird lasting legacy things, is there's this place called Ogawa's Deli there, Ogawa's Sushi Burgers and Bowls in Fruitland, Idaho, that has a Hank bowl, or Hank burger, sorry, menu. And so this is just like one of those things of like this like strange connection between people, like there's this big guy who's big in judo and, semi-pro football player, but he's getting suddenly thrown into a camp with, Bud Mukaye and being trained in sumo by Bud. So it's just a last minute kind of addition, but I thought it was like an interesting little thing about how weird this whole thing of people just being thrown into these assembly centers and camps together, the connections that happen.
And I've learned from my time around martial artists that they don't like to do just one. They like to collect them.
Yeah. So I see the JJ going down a weird rabbit hole on the sideline face that he's got.
I need to look into this
for
face.
You, or are you going to come back to it later?
No. I guess I might as well. I hate when I get called when I was full time in La La Land. But let's show you what La La Land looks like. So yeah, big deal.
Well, so that might be a different guy. So it's Ogawa.
Is this a different guy?
Yeah, it's a different.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
okay.
No, it's
all
okay.
right. Never mind.
Yeah. So he
I
does
went
have
down
a
the wrong rabbit
profile in
hole.
there. No, I did a profile of him on that same website. So like about his whole.
All right.
shit.
I went way down into
No,
La La
it's
Land.
fine.
Don't mind me. Don't mind me.
Okay, all right. So I just
You're
thought that was
back.
interesting. And so kind of back to the cliffhanger that we left everybody at in the last episode was that Bud Mukaye was at Santa Anita right before there was going to be a second tournament at Santa Anita. He'd already won the first tournament at Santa Anita. He wasn't there for the second one, and that's because he and his family were moved to the Gila River concentration camp in Arizona. And then he started doing sumo at Gila River, and there's some coverage of like people training sumo at Gila River, and Bud was involved in that. And then there was going to be a big Thanksgiving Day tournament at Gila River, and that's what this picture is in the kind of center left of this slide, is that Thanksgiving Day tournament. But Bud Mukaye was not there. This is like November 26th of 1942, and Bud is not there, despite his big involvement. And because he wasn't at camp anymore. Wasn't that he got injured or anything like that. He wasn't at camp anymore. So where he was Minnesota.
I know where.
Yeah.
Yep, there you go. That's right. I tried to stay, like I mentioned before, I tried to stay in the dark about this particular individual, but I know that if anybody who was Japanese came to Minnesota during that time, yeah, Camp Savage. I grew up like, I don't know, one town over from there.
Yep. So we've already been starting to kind of play the spot the Bud game in these pictures and group pictures, but there's Bud. Can you guys see him?
I think so. Is
And
that him? Is he the tallest one?
Yeah.
Kinda right in the middle.
And for people who are listening to this, what we're looking at is a picture of about 20 Japanese American men in army uniforms standing in front of a barracks with bare trees behind them. And this is in Camp Savage, Minnesota. So this is like Minnesota in like January or February of 1943 when this picture was taken.
Yeah. One of the things, so I kind of went down a weird rabbit hole of looking at some of the donations that we're doing, and it's never really explained how much of like flipping over the table of someone's life this is. You know,
Yep.
Everybody here is from either Hawaii or like the West Coast, and they're like, oh yeah, let's just go to Minnesota.
Yeah.
Did I hear you say November as well?
So November is when he got. So we'll come back to this picture. So we'll come back to this picture later because there's so much cool stuff to unpack here in this picture. So we'll come back to it. But what happened is starting in November of 1942, a bunch of army recruiters started going around to these concentration camps in the West Coast and also army bases all over the country and started recruiting people for something called MIS. So this is the Military Intelligence Service. So could you go to, so you have the next slide up. So this is a picture from the Amache, Colorado camp. So this is inside a camp in one of these hastily constructed buildings with an army officer swearing in these Nisei young men into the army, like they're being inducted right here. These recruiters went around from camp to camp and army bases collecting people for the Military Intelligence Service. So this picture was provided by Jim McNaughton, and then JJ's added things or pulled things up. Yeah. So Camp Savage.
That's cold. Cold. I just want to say that's cold.
Yeah, especially people from like Southern California. And
no kidding. Guess what my wind chill is going to be tomorrow?
No.
See, we don't have to talk about or think about wind chill. We don't have to.
Well, I'm just saying, like,
I just had to deal with it in Boston, and it hurt. It hurt, and it made me mad and angry.
So what you guys in San Diego might not know is that there is a bizarro world if you keep traveling north where the temperature gets so low it actually hits 0 and keeps getting colder.
That's not a thing.
Right?
That's not. No.
Oh, it's like cryotherapy. Gotcha. No problem.
Yeah.
You just do it for like a minute, and you get health benefits. It's cool.
Hey, tomorrow, yeah, we're like literally in the realm where a minute might cause permanent damage.
Yeah.
We only get like a week or 2 of winter anymore, but tomorrow it's going to be like, I think with the wind, it's going to be negative 30-ish. That's it's going to be fun. And if I had grown up in Southern California, especially doing a sport where I'm like completely exposed to the elements like that, like coming to Minnesota in November, that's even if he did it by choice, like entirely, even if it was under completely non-war circumstances, that is turning your life upside down, flipping the table, like JJ said.
Yeah. And we talked quite a bit actually with Jim during our interview with him, but one of the things that was go ahead.
Quick, as we're talking about Jim, so I'm just going to organically put this in here. Our nonprofit that we're working with on this one is the National Veterans Network. And what's really cool here is that I was just browsing through and I was like, oh, there's a video. I clicked the video and it's Jim. It's Jim with a whole lot of hair talking. And I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. Right. So it's just one of those things. And like, they have so much data here just talking about it, like that cool photo that I showed you where it's absolutely freezing. Like that's here. This is just, there's so much here that you can learn from.
Wow.
Sorry, I just thought I'd add this in instead of going to the echo chamber. We're right here and we're good to go. Back to you.
No, it's fine.
Love it.
But yeah, we talked quite a bit about how, like, what would kind of prompt people to join these places. And like, so Jim had the opportunity to interview a lot of these guys decades later, well into the 90s and aughts, for a book he published, which, can you say linguists? Anyway, plug for his book.
Hold on. Let's go full shot for that. Look at that.
All right. And so bought the book, read the book, very good. We interviewed Jim. But, like JJ was saying, that kind of upending of life, like it was weather, but also people had been uprooted from their homes, gone to assembly centers, gone to concentration camps, scattered in, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, 2 in Arkansas, 2 in Arizona, 2 in California, kind of all over the place. And then these recruiters show up just a couple months after, guys arrived at these camps, and they start trying to recruit them to join the military intelligence service. And we'll talk a little bit about what in the world the MIS did. But, just thinking about, like, I'm just trying to put myself in the shoes of these like young guys being recruited, and what sort of decision making you'd be doing at this point, right? Mm-hmm. Like, you've just been thrown into a camp, right? And all these like competing things, like, do you want to prove your loyalty, and serve and volunteer? Are you tempted to do that, but you have family, parents, kids that you don't want to leave behind? Like, would you be inclined to do it, but you don't want to be volunteering from a camp? Or is it you wouldn't be inclined to volunteer, but anything's better than being in this camp and I want to leave, right? Like, and each person had to make these like decisions like that. And it's just hard to kind of put myself in those shoes, like how like I just have a hard time like wrapping my head around how difficult those choices would be. And I don't know, like that makes me just kind of have like less judgment about whatever choice somebody made. Because like all of those make sense to me. All of those make sense to me.
And I'm sure there's some level of like pressure and some level of like weirdness to it where these are mainly Nisei, right? So it's people that are born here in America, that this is their only home that they've ever known. This is their country. At the same time, they have heritage from elsewhere, and obviously that's the road that leads towards the internment camp philosophy, right? But
Yeah.
like, it's still got to be weird. Like, we're fighting the place that your parents came from.
Yeah.
Help us do it. That's so much more complicated than anything I have ever had to make a decision on in my entire life. That's
Yeah.
nuts.
Also, I think that time itself kind of plays a different role. Like now, if we were one generation away from whatever, it's like the world is a little different, just our perspective, right? We can be more like American, even though some people would say no or whatever. But like that's from them, they're still in that household
Yeah.
of like pure like Japanese speak. They're closer to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I for a split second I was like, what if we declared war on France or something, or
Mhm.
France, Germany, where like my ancestors came from? And my initial thought was like, what? Who cares? I'm American. But like, that's 10 generations, not one, And it's also, there's the complication of racism where like, because I mean, let's not talk like, Irish, Italian racism and, 100 years ago or whatever. For the most part, these days, if you're white, whether it's French or German or English or whatever. So like, there isn't that extra layer of complicated to it, and that's being newer, like just the one generation in America, plus people are pretty shitty to you because you look different. Like, that's
Mhm.
just an extra
Mhm.
layer of separation that like instantly, like I said, for a split second I was like, yeah, what would it be like for me? And it's like, there's no like that for me. That's just not how it works. It's completely different.
Yeah, and I think there's like some kind of analogs as far as like the amount of time between when the wave of immigration was and when World War II happened that
Mhm.
are actually fairly similar to Italian Americans. And Italian Americans did encounter a lot of prejudice when they arrived, but
Right.
there was still mostly this almost sense, even though like it sometimes looks and feels like racism, and there was definitely like discrimination and a lot of derogatory terms and all kinds of stuff. At the same time, it was more like that's a cultural difference still. Like, they're
Sure.
from like this backward Mediterranean, and there was a lot of like religious prejudice worked into it too. It was,
Right.
predominantly Catholic, right? There was that. But um it wasn't really kind of a question, because the MIS is not like a combat unit that went to Europe, but one of the decisions about like creating a combat unit of Japanese Americans to fight in Europe was we can't send a whole combat unit of Japanese people to fight in the Pacific because we're not sure about them. But there was no question, and it was a segregated unit. And there was no question about that for Germans or Italians, right? Going to Europe to fight. Like,
There
it's even a
was.
trope in all the World War II movies of like,
Mhm.
there's the guy who speaks German because he's German, and there's the Italian guy from Brooklyn, like.
There was definitely some of that, but like, again, when people get lumped together, whatever the current gender or whatever the current definition is of white, there certainly was like some
Mhm.
teeny tiny, completely pales in comparison level of xenophobia towards people of
Yeah.
German descent. But like, yeah, not to the point where they were worried about sending Germans to the Western Front, right?
Right. Right. And so that is like a big difference. So what's so interesting, and this is where let's go to the next slide and start kind of talking about what the MIS did, because there are some documentaries about this. There's websites about it. There's veterans organizations dedicated kind of telling MIS stories. But I think this is a really undertold. It's not untold, but undertold story in World War II. So as soon as the Army and Navy both started figuring out that there was probably going to be a war against Japan, there was this desire and need to have people who spoke Japanese, who could, you can have radio intercepts and crack a code, but if you can't read the language, what use is that if
Yeah.
you don't understand the subtext, and then if you come into direct combat or radio, like live, verbal radio intercepts. Like how are you going to interpret that? So both in 1941 start expanding language programs. So the MIS is the Army's language program. There was a Navy language program, but the Navy basically would not let Nisei serve, like, at all.
They just had a slightly more racist guy at the top of the ladder making the decision or something, or what do you
all
think?
the way at the top. Yeah, just the Navy.
A little bit bigger than slightly.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So, right. The Navy was just like,
we're grading out a curve for the 40s here, JJ.
Yeah.
Excuse me.
Yeah. So the Army, though, and this is the weird thing, like Jim talks about the weirdness of it, is the guy who later signs off on and drives in a lot of ways the removal of all Nikkei from the West Coast is the same guy who is in charge of the Western Military Command in the US, based out of the Presidio in San Francisco, John DeWitt, who we need to have a language program. And so basically they start scooping up people to create this language program. And that the center top picture is at Crissy Field in San Francisco. It's a little airfield just near the Golden Gate Bridge. You can like see Alcatraz from there. It's by the Presidio of San Francisco. And they set up in like an airplane hangar a language school with like 60 students, a few teachers, and they start training on Japanese, military Japanese, handwritten Japanese, like the sort of thing you might like write have a courier in a little notebook and have a courier take it like to another command post, that sort of stuff, like interrogation techniques, all kinds of things, captured or kind of, requisitioned pre-war military manuals, all kinds of stuff. But this also coincides with the war breaking out, and suddenly the Army moves all these soldiers out of critical positions. Some also there's a ban on Japanese Americans being officers. So there were officers in the Army who had like perfect language skills, who basically, like, in order to teach at this school, had to like resign their commission, leave the Army, and come back as civilian instructors. Just
That's
wild stuff. Yeah. So John Iso was one of the people who founded this school. He was a lawyer pre-war. He'd worked in Japan as an attorney, had all kinds of business and diplomatic connections. He later goes on to become a judge in LA. And he's tragically murdered decades later during a carjacking. And it's actually the street in downtown LA where the Sumo Association and the dohyo used to be, North San Pedro Street, is now named Judge John Iso Street after him. And he was basically the guy as a civilian who ran, like he was the top civilian and the top, like he was the place who ran the daily operations. There were a couple like white officers who were technically in charge as Army officers.
Sure.
But he really ran the show. Like everybody is like, Iso ran the show. Eventually the policy gets changed later in the war because of the critical work that the MIS does. And he becomes a major, I think, toward the end of the war. But so there's this language training. When they move to Camp Savage, they do all kinds of like hardcore 6 days a week language training, like just mentally exhausting. And then also it's February in Minnesota and you're going to, put a pack on and run around in the dark. Welcome to Minnesota, Hawaiians.
Oh yeah, that part too. You only get like 8 hours of sunlight sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. So, they go through this intensive language program, and that's what Bud Mukaye like volunteered for. And so one thing that's interesting, Jake, that you talked about earlier, is that most of these guys that were recruited, they're like really desirable recruits, were actually people who'd spent a lot of time in Japan as kibe.
Gotcha.
So they'd been in Japan. They could speak Japanese fairly fluently. They could read and write Japanese better. These were like the bread and butter, like what they wanted recruits. And there are some of these recruits who would try to fail the language test because they wanted to be in a combat unit and they didn't want to be in this like rear echelon translation unit.
With the nerds. Yeah,
with the nerds, and they didn't want to do that. So they ended up, getting, they want to stay with their units and go, yeah, so there's John Iso. Yeah. And there he is in his military uniform. Yeah, he was quite something. Like he was apparently also like the bludgeon that was used against most Nisei children about like, why can't you be more like John Iso? Because he was like a star student getting all kinds of scholarships. He was fighting like discrimination when he, like he would win a essay or a rhetoric prize at a school. And basically it's like, no, we can't give it to you. You're not white. And yeah. And so he would like, fight stuff like that. And then he became a lawyer. And so, he was the exemplar of like the perfect Nisei that used as a bludgeon against all other children, apparently.
You can't be excellent in what you do without it being a weapon, I guess.
Yeah. So John Iso, he's a fascinating guy, like both before, during, and after the war. Like he just keeps crazy influential.
There's some people that just like live more life in the same amount of time than the rest of us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he was definitely one of those people.
Mm-hmm.
So what the MIS did is I talked about like that translation and interpretation stuff, and what a lot of the guys who volunteered for it or even tried to get out of it, but usually they'd cotton on to the fact that people were, trying to fail the test on purpose, and they'd like, nah, you're coming anyway. Especially any active duty military guys, they'd be like, nah, you're already in, sorry. And they just transfer them to Camp Savage. Let
me go fight on the front lines. Just don't send me to Minnesota in the winter.
Oh man. Well, I mean, some of these guys, end up, regretting it, of course, but even the volunteers, but they end up doing some really kind of fascinating stuff. So what ended up happening is these guys, after their training was done, is they'd get put together in these language teams of about 10 or 5, but usually 10. Also, some would get sent in huge batches to like MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Command created this like whole intelligence hub coordinating with like the Australians and like British India and all kinds of stuff to coordinate intelligence gathering and material. And so they'd be like, we want 200 interpreters, and they would scramble to like graduate classes and send people over. But then they were having to like, how do we keep some of our best students here to like keep teaching?
Right.
So they start sending these units over to the Pacific, and usually they'll attach like a team to a division. So like a division is like 5,000 combat soldiers or something like that, plus all kinds of support personnel, and like here's 10 linguists. And each team, and this is something that I found like really interesting kind of looking back on it, and it didn't really occur to me till today, thinking about what Jim was telling us, is that most of them would then be paired up. And there would be one guy who was the reading guy, and one would be the talking guy with like better spoken language skills. And so they have a pair like that would then kind of go down to like, battalion or regimental level, or, like this unit is encountering a Japanese unit and they think, they're actually going to get captives, or they might be able to, figure something out. They'd send a team, and it would be a reading guy and a talking guy, basically. And what's interesting is like looking at some of these pictures, especially some later pictures you're going to see, you can almost spot which is which. And that's the funny thing. You'll see these pictures of like two guys. There's two Nisei guys, and they'll be interrogating somebody, and each of these pictures that you see, the bottom 3 pictures, these are toward the front lines. One's a rear area kind of interview setup. The middle one is in a POW pen in the Philippines. And then the one on the bottom left, I don't know where it is in the Pacific, but it looks far more frontline. Like everybody's
they're wearing helmets. Yeah.
Yeah. They're wearing helmets. They're hunkered down behind something solid, but they're chatting, right? It's a little bit more frontline. But in each of these, you can kind of see there's one guy who has like a crisper collar, wearing glasses, and there's a later picture you'll even see, you can kind of see more rank insignia around the neck, even though like similar rank, he's showing his rank insignia. And then there'll be this other guy with like rumpled boots, dirty, like kind of hair disheveled, and like you're like, that's the talking guy. Like that's the guy who's sitting across from some frontline soldier and just talking to him and trying to like build rapport and get information, right?
Sure,
so
he's not sitting back somewhere where he can like iron his shirt while he's just sitting
yeah,
around reading the paper, right?
yeah. So these units, like they end up doing all kinds of stuff. So before we get to the next slide, one of the things that's a big part of what they do is like capturing documents and either reading them right there, like they take overrun a Japanese command post, or all the stuff is boxed and bagged up and sent back to like a division headquarters, and then there's a team just digging through this stuff for anything useful. And what they do find is they need to have people closer to the front for fresh intelligence.
Sure.
But like Jim talked, like he kind of hints at it, but there's more details in his book about the like crates of this stuff even getting sent stateside because they just don't have the capacity to process it, in these South Pacific islands or New Guinea. And it arrives in America and it's opened up at Camp Savage, and it, smells of like human decay and mud because it was found with like dead bodies and, like,
sure.
And then it's personal diaries. It's people talking about their lives and, their relationships and family and their comrades. And that's a very different kind of way of interacting with the war, especially the Pacific War, than we think of, right?
Yeah, totally.
And so it ends up being like very intimate with your opponent, right? And where your job for these Nisei linguists was to understand and connect, build rapport, and understand the enemy. Which is just very different because what so much of the rest of the Pacific War, like is this war without mercy is what John Dower, an author, calls it. And where it's just a war of flamethrowers and napalm and, take no prisoners on both sides. So this is so different than that, like what these guys were trained and needing to do.
They probably had to keep a lot of the situational information in their head at all times so that they can, like you mentioned, like hypothetically they overrun a command post and everything in the entire command post is written in a language that you are one of only two people, you and your partner. You got to sift through all of it to see what stuff would be important. That's you got to be very in tune with what's going on in the whole greater situation in order to make those decisions.
Yep.
And what else? And yeah, what stuff needs to go to the boss right now? What stuff needs to go in the box and sent back to Minnesota to get read by, the language school?
Yeah. And the sorts of things these soldiers are having to do at this point is crazy when you think about it. Before we get to some of the next couple stories, like there's a few that aren't kind of in there, but talk about the general work they did. We talked about kind of the document side and the interrogation side, but the other thing some of these guys would do is they would, crawl out in front of American lines into Japanese positions and then pretend to be a Japanese officer.
Wow.
And command Japanese units to attack a prepared ambush. Like they would do stuff like, if a captured prisoner, successfully interrogate them and find out like the whole layout of the next hill that they need to take, and then figure out, like with the command team at a regiment or, a division, how to bypass it, attack it, suppress it, like all these incredibly kind of practical, at the tactical level sort of stuff. Like these were not, rear echelon positions necessarily. Some were in like Brisbane, Australia, hundreds of guys sifting through documents, and writing analysis reports. But then there were these teams that went out with divisions into combat. And so the next slide, if you could go to that one with about Hoichi Kubo. So Hoichi Kubo is this guy from Hawaii. He was in the army. He got recruited. This is one of the guys who tried to fail the test because he wanted to stay with his Hawaiian battalion. And instead, he got drafted in. But this is a picture of him on Saipan. And on Saipan, this was the first significant battle where there was a Japanese civilian population there within the battle zone. And Hoichi Kubo does a bunch of things here, including, he finds out from a captured prisoner that there's going to be one of those suicidal charges that's going to happen, but it wasn't intended to be suicidal. It was, I think the guy being interviewed used this term for basically a shattered jewel, like an all or nothing attack. And, Hoichi Kubo just picks up like, they're throwing an entire division at us. And so he basically lets the commanders know about that's what's going to be coming. And they prepare a defense. And even with that, they almost get overrun, like the American forces. Like even with knowing this is going to be nobody's seeking cover, nobody's doing covering fire. They are just sprinting toward you to get close and kill you. Like that's what it is. It almost worked, despite the advanced intelligence. Like that's how strong this attack was.
That's I'm sure that's hundreds of lives directly on Kubo then.
Yeah.
That are here because, well, not here anymore. I mean, because it's almost 100 years ago, but you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And what happened is stories like this started spreading more within the command in the Pacific. And because of that, there started to be more demand for these MIS interpreters, but also, what can we gain from taking prisoners, right? Like there's just a practical advantage to taking prisoners, right? Beyond a humanitarian Geneva Convention one, which Japan didn't sign on to the Geneva Convention, but, right. And so the other thing that happens is, and this is where Hoichi Kubo, this is like the legendary story with him, is that toward the end, after organized resistance ended, there were these caves along the northern edge of the island right by the seacoast, and people who may have heard or seen of these, of Japanese civilians throwing themselves off the cliff into the sea, into the rocks, to commit suicide because of their fear of what the Americans are going to do. And some of that was compelled by Japanese soldiers who were hiding in those caves with them. So basically what happens is Hoichi Kubo's commander finds out that there's a cave down the cliff that's holding an unknown number of Japanese civilians and a handful, they don't know how many Japanese soldiers. So he ropes down the hill, this cliff face, into this cave with what did Jim say, JJ? Like a 45 in his back waistband?
Yes, the most American like G.I. Joe moment ever.
And naturally he just landed the most picture perfect one-liner as well, right? As soon as he set foot there.
Yeah,
but in Japanese.
But in Japanese.
Right. It doesn't translate well. Yeah, so never mind. Well,
so Kubo goes into this cave and there's like a squad of soldiers, like 8 or 9 Japanese soldiers. And he uses like every trick he learned from kind of interrogation, psychological warfare, training, everything, his own life experience, to like every trick available. Like he brings some rations because these guys have been hungry and hunkered down in a cave, right? Water. So that stuff. He shames them about the fact that they're from some rear echelon, whatever supply unit, whereas his father served in the Russo-Japanese War in this elite unit. Like you don't even know. And plus you guys are just like the highest ranked, one of you is like a senior private or something. And here I am, a sergeant, and so he's like using everything. Plus he's like eating food with them. And he's talking about like, what are you doing? Like, what kind of code are you living by that you're shielding behind these civilians? Like, if you want to die a glorious death for the emperor, fine. But what do these civilians have to do about it? And so he spends hours down talking with these guys, and he negotiates the release of all of the civilians, like hundreds of them. And they start pulling them up out of the cave. And then eventually he convinces this handful of guys that it's not worth dying for. There's no glory in this kind of death. or faithful service you're providing? Like, what is this going to do?
Mm-hmm.
And he convinces them to surrender too. And for that, he wins the Distinguished Service Cross, or earns the Distinguished Service Cross, which is the second highest medal that the Army can, grant to anybody.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's
a lot
awesome.
of this we did cover with Jim.
Yeah.
So definitely, if this intrigues you, just know that this is just a drop in the bucket of this like giant ocean of information that Jim was able to provide to us.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then there's one thing, JJ, could you go back to that Camp Savage picture?
Of course. Eventually.
That first one with Bud in it?
Yep. Okay. So sitting directly in front of Bud Mukaye there, that's Hoichi Kubo.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah. That was wild when because I knew about the Bud showing up in this picture. Mm-hmm. But then after I read the Kubo story and a couple other stories in Jim's book, I was looking through, and then I looked at this list of names, and that's, Hoichi Kubo sitting, right in front of Bud Mukaye. They were in the same barrack together at Camp Savage, same graduating class.
Man, that's really cool. And looking at that picture again, after, talking about this other stuff, like, man, if I had to guess which guy did sumo in that one, it'd be the guy whose shoulders are twice as wide as everybody else. Look at that guy.
Yep. Yeah, we'll get to that, which is weird. Like, kind of the sumo story, part of this ends, but it does still keep being a reference about Bud that comes up. It's really interesting.
I'm sure everybody who meets him is like, oh yes, this giant jacked Japanese guy. He came and he translated documents for us or something.
Yeah. So that's Hoichi Kubo. But the other thing, and this is where some of those like sumo stories come in, is that Bud was on one of these like division level teams of 10, and he was a team leader in that team. People who knew him and served with him, both from his barracks and in his army units, who were interviewed decades later after his death, talk about what a natural leader he was. And he's just seemed bigger than life, both physically, personality. And, there's also hints in here in this little quick quote about how he just seemed bigger, like a sumo wrestler, even though he really wasn't. He just like projected this size. And he always had like kind of close cropped hair. But like two other things is that before the removal and incarceration, he apparently like argued in public meetings among friends against family about, kind of cooperating with the removal and incarceration, because this was an active conversation within the Nikkei community on the West Coast about, we know this is coming, what are we going to do? Mm-hmm. And what emerged was a consensus to show loyalty by cooperating and then prove, right? Yeah. And so, this is, and then when he went to Camp Savage, that he was a troublemaker, but this is also a guy who volunteered in like the first batch of volunteers, and then served at the very front lines. So it's just really, I don't know, like, it's one of those things where why did he do what he did? And I don't know. I still don't know.
Reading between the lines, one of my guesses here is that he was just in between calling him a troublemaker. It says he's a headache to Savage staffers, but he has a winning smile and can melt the coldest and most sullen prisoner, etc. My take on this guy is he's probably just a huge personality that uses his superpower of confidence and to get things that he wants for him and his community. That's kind of my hypothesis here.
Yeah,
like you kind of have to be a good leader, like a middle management level leader here. He's not commanding armies or whatever, but he's still a leader of the people behind him, right? you kind of have to be a bit of a butthead to get
Mhm.
what you want for the people that you're representing. And that's the vibe that I'm getting from the different places where it brings him up. He's bigger than life. Um, he volunteers first, but still then causes trouble. I'm guessing the trouble is probably just sticking up for himself, sticking up
Yeah.
for the people that are volunteering with him. But I don't know. That's what I'm getting. Kind of the subtext of the little bit that we've been able to read so far.
Yeah, well, and also from, how he was involved in sumo and as a booster of sumo and a coach in sumo,
Yeah,
in the
he's
mid
got that
30s.
organizer kind of thing to him, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, but it does just raise that thing of you can read things about somebody, and every once in a while you'll see or hear something, and it's that person's voice. But overall, like I have to sometimes step back and go, like, I don't actually know this person. Like, I don't know if I would have been friends or if I'd like them or like if they were a
Sure.
decent human being. Like, I have no idea. Like, it's just they're an interesting story
Hmm.
and clearly a larger than life person. But I don't know if they were like good or not.
Yeah,
Like, I don't
maybe
know,
he was a
right?
total dick.
Yeah, and I don't know. Like, it really is just an I don't know, right?
Right, right. But
Yeah.
yeah, it definitely the amount of times that he comes up and the amount of times where, especially like in our last episodes talking about him being like one of the organizers of this, or
Yeah.
helping rally people to do this or that, or the fundraiser stuff that he was doing. It's like, yeah, this guy definitely feels like the local leader role model type for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So his division, like, we don't know exactly what he did between when he graduated from Camp Savage and until like late 1944. So like really, yeah, almost like, over a year and a half. We don't really know what he did. But we do know that in October of 1944, his division, the 7th Infantry Division, was the one of the divisions that landed on Leyte Island in the central Philippines. Um, and his division, both here and in later battles, is always on the left flank. Don't know why, always on the left flank.
Hmm.
And they landed on Leyte and pushed westward across the island, and then eventually end up on the western coast. And that also means they are the absolute furthest from the American supply bases on the east coast of the island. And even some of the battles here, like they're called like Shoestring Ridge, and they have names like that just as the scarcity of like supply and logistics. Because they landed also toward the end of the rainy season in the Southwest Pacific. So it was
Yikes.
pouring rain. And they're just traveling over what even now looks like it's just dense green forest. And so this is a picture on the right of Filipino civilian porters helping transport supplies for the U.S. Army from the supply bases in the central and east part of Leyte to the west side of the island, where the Japanese had decided to make that the main focus of resistance, and they moved like 3 additional divisions in to defend around the city of Ormoc. And so the 7th Infantry Division like gets to the west coast, and then they push along the west coast, and it's a grinding battle for months, like months. And the mop-up operations don't finish until like February of 1945. So this is like a 4-month campaign. Yeah. And Bud Mukaye was there for that campaign. And we don't have any kind of specific stories about what exactly he did. But then after this, they have a couple months of rest and preparation for their next operation. Really quick, we'll just show like a slide before we do of what kind of Leyte looked like. We just added a map really quick. So they landed on the kind of left side of that map, and then they pushed west, and like you might be able to see in a tiny bit, like it says 7th Infantry 7 ID or something down there.
Sure.
And so yeah, and then they push up toward the city of Ormoc. So then they land in Okinawa. So and the 7th Infantry Division lands on April 1st, 1945. And they push straight east across the island and then south. So it's kind of the exact opposite of what they did in Lady, where they pushed west and then they pushed north as the left flank. This, they push east and then they were on the left flank and pushing south. And when they, how much do you guys know about the Battle for Okinawa?
Specifically that battle? I don't think I know anything about it.
Ooh. It's rough. It's like
that, I believe.
It's like, imagine Stalingrad, the Western Front in World War I, but with volcanic and coral reef topography.
So we're talking like really dug in, fighting tooth and nail for every yard forward you go, kind of battle.
Yeah, trenches, bunkers, machine gun nests in areas where there's a large civilian population, working around buildings, and with, hills, caves, and hills from which, there could be observation, and huge like tunnel complexes dug underneath. When the 7th Infantry Division hits its first resistance, the landings are almost unopposed. They push east, they push south. About a week and a half in, they suddenly hit this point called the Pinnacle. And at the Pinnacle, it turns out later that they just find out it's an outpost of the defensive line, but their division suffers 1,500 casualties just taking a hill.
Jeez.
And the Japanese unit defending it, this is just an outpost, lost 4,500 killed.
Yikes. That is just staggering numbers for, like you said, it compares to World War I, where, thousands and thousands of people dying for just a few feet for one hill for whatever. Yeah.
And from that point, when they hit like the initial resistance, in early April still, but I think it's like April 11th or so, for the next basically 6 weeks, they are just grinding south. And I used those comparisons, but the thing to add to this is that it takes them 6 weeks to go the next distance, which ends up being only about 9 kilometers.
Ugh.
So I don't know, 9 kilometers. But this is also with naval battleships just hanging right off the coast, able to lob massive shells. There's napalm at that point, right? Like there's the ability to just saturate bombing in these areas. And it still took 6 weeks to grind 9 kilometers.
That's nuts.
And yeah, it's really kind of crazy. So the Shuri line was built around Shuri Castle, which is the old Okinawan capital. And it's actually undergoing a cool major restoration project because it got completely destroyed. And so there were these lines to kind of protect Shuri Castle. It's just brutal fighting. And some of those pictures, we don't necessarily have to go back, but there were these little, apertures, machine gun nests all over the place. And also amidst all that, there were over 40,000 Okinawans who were drafted into the Japanese army to serve as couriers, porters, and child soldiers. So those, kids you saw there were maybe like 13, 14, and they're in, Japanese army uniforms, captured later. There's just this grind. And Bud's division, the 7th Infantry Division, eventually manages to take this hill called the Conical Hill, which is on the left hand side of left flank, but it's the right or east side of this map if you're looking at the map. And once they take that, they have like a commanding position over this city of Yonobaru in this valley, and from there they're able to kind of like plaster artillery wherever they want, see any Japanese movement. So they actually break through. So his division is one of the ones that breaks through on the Japanese right flank. And then once that happens, they encounter this massive counterattack to try to cover the retreat then from Shuri Castle. So in late May, the Japanese forces, the last several tens of thousands of soldiers, retreat to the southern end of Okinawa. And then there's still, mopping up operations until mid-June at that point. Yikes. For another month. So just Okinawa is just the scale of it. And I've talked a little bit about growing up in Japan, but I grew up, I was a missionary kid, and a lot of people who converted to my religion I grew up in were Okinawan Japanese. There was a large kind of Okinawan population who had, kind of converted after the war. And, I heard these stories from, church members, from, acquaintances who'd been missionaries in Okinawa. And then once I came to America, a lot of people who went to Japanese American churches where my dad was a pastor, and in Hawaii, were survivors, with, serious injuries, and talking about their experience living through the war.
Yikes.
And so it's another just reminder that this wasn't that long ago. I heard stories as a kid and, an early 20 something from survivors of this, these battles. Yeah.
That's a completely different side of it that we have, because other than obviously Pearl Harbor, other than that, didn't really take place on American soil very much. So and I know that Okinawa is far from the only one, but there's plenty of places in Japan that still have the scars of that war on their own turf that they've rebuilt from. Obviously, Hiroshima and Nagasaki being the two obvious elephants in the room.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine what that's like to have that level of total war on your own soil, and then just have those scars through the generations.
Yeah. And the stories you hear from MIS soldiers from this era is also just a very different type of story than you hear. So one of the pictures we had from the earlier page, where we had those 5 pictures of what the MIS did, the guy with the glasses talking to those POWs, that was a book about a guy named, there's a book about that guy called Midnight in Broad Daylight. That guy's name was Harry Fukuhara, and he was an MIS interpreter in the Philippines, Okinawa, and then when he went to Japan as part of the U.S. occupation, one of his first missions was to try to find his siblings and mom who were in Japan, because he'd grown up in the Seattle area, and they'd moved to Japan in the mid-30s, and he'd lived in Japan in Okinawa. I mean, sorry, not Okinawa, Hiroshima. I'm sorry if I've been saying Okinawa, Hiroshima. So one of his first things was to go to Hiroshima and try to find his family, because that's where his family were from, and and then also stories of there's some really interesting oral histories with people talking about, and we talk about this a bit more with Jim's interview, both Harry Fukuhara, but also there were guys in the MIS in Okinawa who went to school there. They lived there, especially a lot of the Hawaiian Nisei were from had spent time in Okinawa and knew people, gone to school there. One guy interrogated his classmates, former classmates who were in the Japanese army, and they didn't recognize him at first, so he messed with them. But but and then afterwards, a reunion and hugs and crying together, right? This is just a very different kind of experience of the Pacific War than we're kind of used to hearing about, in a way of relating to the enemy, who were the enemy. That was the job of these MIS guys, and they knew that was their job, and they did it. But they didn't have that option of dehumanizing their enemy and just having this racial hatred and write them off as animals to be exterminated, or vermin, and that was the language that was used in a lot of the Pacific War on both sides.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Monsters and vermin back and forth.
It's a lot harder when you've got history tied in so deeply like that. It's a lot harder for those stereotypical war propaganda type of messages to take hold.
Yeah. And so the next picture, we'll go way down. It's all right.
It's okay.
Quick breeze through our history so far here.
Yeah. Spot the bud.
Oh, this one's a little easier than most of them.
Yes, I'll give you 3 guesses.
Yeah. Need 2 of them.
Yeah. So there's Bud on the left, and this is on Okinawa, just at the very end of the war. And the reason I ran across this picture, and the reason we interviewed Jim McNaughton, is this is actually the picture that's used on the cover of Jim's book, Nisei Linguist. So the one I have is a different cover, but the one I found online has this picture of Bud Mukaye and Ralph Saito, who's another sergeant. And again, with that game of like spot the interrogator, spot the reader, like
yeah,
right. Bud's the talker, and Ralph is the reader, right?
I'm not gonna lie, Ralph. I don't know if he got lucky here or if he's that photogenic, but he looks very cool.
It looks cool with those
He does look cool.
Yeah, he does. Yeah. And I mean, Bud almost always, like, from all his pictures, his like hair's cut pretty short. It's usually disheveled. Like he just like that's not what worries him. But yeah, they're interrogating a sailor, and this picture was taken just at the very end of the battle in Okinawa. Interrogating this Imperial Japanese Navy sailor. And weirdly, in the National Archives, I even found like a little tiny written bit of note from Bud Mukaye talking about the Fugo balloon bomb, like incendiary balloon campaign. So like there's even these like tidbits you can find in the National Archives of like intelligence gathered from interviews by Bud.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
That's one of my, like, when I found out about that, I was like, oh, I mean, I guess it was an idea.
Yeah, it's weird. Like, if people don't know, the Fugo balloon campaign was weird. So like the Japanese military created like hot air balloons with like explosive charges, and then they basically raised them up into the jet stream to fly across the Pacific. And like, I don't know, half a dozen of them like landed in the Pacific Northwest. Like one like did tragically land like and start a forest fire near where like a family was having a picnic in Oregon. Yeah. But yeah, it was the bizarre things people experimented with. Like, yeah, this is the breakthrough technology.
Hey, I actually have that open right now here.
NPR article about that, and it's amazing.
Yeah.
I have heard of this before because I was just scanning through the Wikipedia intro here, and yeah, on May 5th of 1945, 6 civilians were killed by one of these bombs in Oregon, becoming the war's only fatalities in the contiguous United States.
Yep,
that's it. That one random ass balloon that they just whatever. Let's just send this over the biggest ocean on the planet, and
they made a lot. There was a lot of balloons.
Yeah.
It was like a serious like
9,000 that they had sent. Yeah.
In just one balloon.
Yeah, and that's where it's like really probably not worth the investment. But yeah, just weird things you run across.
The bombs were ineffective as fire starters due to damp seasonal conditions.
That's the Pacific Northwest. Like,
I think that's more of a regional thing than a seasonal thing.
Yeah, that's just it's damp. Yeah. So it's just amazing to like kind of run across these pictures and see all this. So a couple other things with this is it's worth also just talking quickly about just the cost to Okinawan civilians during the Battle for Okinawa. The population of Okinawa at the time was about just shy of 500,000, and 100,000 civilians were killed during the battle.
Wow.
20% of the population or more. And a solid 100,000 of those were just civilians. There were about 40 some thousand who were, I don't know, inducted into the Japanese army and used for a variety of purposes and also killed. So like massive. And those numbers, there's a little, with any war casualties, there's some debate, but like that's very high. Because it was fighting over the most populous part of the island, and it's heartbreaking. I should have grabbed the book that I've gotten a lot of stories from to kind of hold it up to. I'll definitely add it for the bibliography that we're going to put together. But oral histories of Okinawan civilians and survivors about the things that the Japanese army made them do during the war, as far as like forced mass suicides. Like,
I think that it's hard to explain how the Okinawans were, like, culturally there's inside of Japan there is an Okinawan and then like Japanese. So with that being said, there was this, they were trying to be more Japanese and follow rules of Japanese. So there's a little bit to that we don't quite understand, just being Americans. And I think that's good to kind of pinpoint that a little bit more, Nathan.
Yeah. So Okinawans were for centuries a vassal kingdom off, by China or Japan, where they'd pay some like taxes. They'd be kind of a trade port in between China and Japan, but they were a distinct ethnicity with a distinct language and a distinct kingdom. During most of the Tokugawa period, that's the 1600s through 1860s, they were a vassal kingdom of like Satsuma, which is where Kagoshima is in southern Kyushu now. But then Okinawa became one of the first places that became part of the Japanese Empire and like taken over and kind of colonized. And there was a lot of forced Japanese language acquisition and cultural adoption, and a lot of struggle by Okinawans then to try to preserve some of their culture and traditions and language, but especially after the war, to try to kind of reclaim some Okinawan identity. Like, a lot of people who move to Hawaii, live in Hawaii, not like they're Okinawan American, like as much or more than they are Japanese American. And that's not universal, but that, Okinawan is a distinct ethnic group within Japan, native to the Ryukyu Islands. Just like in northern Japan, where I was born, the Ainu are an indigenous people of Japan, in Hokkaido and northern Japan and the Sakhalin Islands. And so Japan has, native ethnic minorities. And so the Okinawans, yes, they were Japanese, but also they were, treated disposably by the Japanese military. And the hard feelings a lot of Okinawans have are, based on what Americans did in their bombing of Naha. This is an aerial view of Naha, the capital of Okinawa, but also the Japanese military and what the Japanese military was telling the civilians about what the Americans were going to do. And their obligations of duty and service, and because the Americans are going to do terrible things to you, you all need to kill yourselves, and we're not going to give you any weapons to do that, so use what you have at hand. And so all the grown men were being drafted to serve in the military, so who's left to do that, to kill their family, their neighbors?
It sounds like just one of many cultures just utterly and horribly caught in the middle. And like World War II, I'm no historian or anything, but like I'm more familiar with, the European theater where Poland got conquered by Germany and then got conquered again by Russia on the way back, or I guess the USSR. But like, Okinawa, if you haven't seen it on a map, Okinawa is like not next to Japan.
No,
it's like halfway to China. It's
almost to Taiwan. Yeah,
exactly. There's yeah, that there's a string of islands that basically goes from southern Japan all the way to Taiwan and China, and like, yeah, Okinawa is like halfway down there, so it's not next door. We're talking like, I guess another similarity that comes to mind is like how we treat Hawaii. You know, like it's very far away. It's got its own native culture, but because the U.S. is like the governing, you know, the country that, I don't want to say the word owns, that feels really gross, but like, you know, they're part of the United States.
Yeah.
Despite being physically isolated and having its own history.
Yeah.
And yeah, caught in the middle. It's
yes. The idea of a territory of a country is ownership, right? It's gross, but that's what it is.
I just was trying to find a better way to phrase it, but you know what I meant.
Yeah, it's just gross. And then, you know, for it to be a state is just a little bit more control, right? Of the property.
I imagine that when we look into the history of sumo in Hawaii down the road, we will have a lot of difficult conversations.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting. Yeah, and you know, those will be a lot of interesting stories. One thing, because I do need something slightly lighter after talking about this, though, is one of the things that's interesting about like a lot of the Hawaiians in the MIS, the Hawaiian Nikkei, is how like they had such a hard time with like Japanese honorifics, and if they had to like talk to a Japanese general or diplomat or dignitary, because they were just Hawaiian, like super casual, and they're like, you know, and like they spoke pidgin English, and like, yeah, and so they were like the Hawaiians, like, and the mainland Nisei were just like literal fist fights in barracks and all kinds of stuff. But you know, they all worked together and earned their keep, you know, when they went. But like, yeah, like a lot of the Hawaiian Nisei MIS soldiers, like veterans, talk about just how like I don't know, like I didn't care, like Hawaiian, you know, like island culture. Yeah,
that is one stereotype that I've yet to find an exception to. I don't know a ton of people from Hawaii, but they're all very chill.
Yeah. So a couple things, if you do want to kind of see in the press and the media about what, you know, that looked like and what the fighting in Okinawa looked like. What's amazing to me is how little there is. There's documentaries and things like that, but how few movies there are and TV shows. I just finished rewatching The Pacific. So that's, you know, probably the best, but the episode 9 of The Pacific is all about the Battle of Okinawa. On the opposite side of the island with the Marines on the west side of the island, but it's very good, and it also does, I think, especially the Pacific, captures how civilians were caught in the middle of it, and how Marines who'd been fighting their way across Pacific Islands, waging a war without mercy, to keep using, you know, that phrase, then suddenly they're encountering civilians, you know, and what does that look like? And, you know, that previous picture, I don't know if you get, sorry to go back, JJ, but, you know, that is an Okinawan war orphan in a foxhole with 2, you know, soldiers or Marines, I can't tell, you know, basically just shielding him in a foxhole because his parents had been killed or disappeared or got separated, right? And so they would take these orphans under their wing, these American soldiers. Just the war was so different in Okinawa, but at the same time, the same, you know? So moving back to Bud's story a little bit. So, you know, recommendations for if you want to get kind of a visual look to what this looks like. This is one of the first choice quotes I found about Bud. This is a note written on a veterans forum in 2007 by a guy named Grant Ichikawa, who also in that picture from Camp Savage was in the same barrack with him.
Of course.
Also in that picture.
Is that picture like this story's version of like the Argo in mythology, where it's like the all-star team of everybody that comes up in the story?
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird. My wife and I were like just talking about how she's doing some other history research or something else, and we're both kind of fascinated by these like places and times where it's like everybody's there and intersecting and like what in the world, and like all these different stories, like this strange hub place. Like I don't even like Woody Allen movies, but like Midnight in Paris is like a weird version of that. It's like, wow, yeah, Paris in the 20s or 30s, yeah, wild.
Okay.
But that picture is kind of that, yeah, like
Sure.
the Argo. All the heroes are on that ship. Sorry, nerds.
Hey, we got it. We got some. We're going into history, and me and Nathan got off on classical for a second there.
Yeah. We got super highbrow.
There's your bingo space for tangent related to ancient history.
I think people are doing shots for that.
Yeah. So this guy Grant Ichikawa talks about how he got completely separated from Bud as far as what they did during the war. But he didn't see Bud again until 1951, when Grant was recalled during the Korean conflict and went back to Japan, and ran into Bud in Hokkaido, where he was working for the 441st Counterintelligence Corps Detachment. So he's still serving in Japan 6 years after the end of the war. And this is the thing that's both super intriguing and infuriating about this whole research into Bud is the end. Like is like he disappears. He's a counterintelligence agent in Japan in 1951, and then he's like a ghost. The only other references, there's only 3 other references I can find to Bud after this. So one is that in 1955, his father applies for U.S. citizenship. Once Japanese, like Issei, are able to apply for U.S. citizenship, it's one of the first things Bud's dad does. And he says his son, Bud, is in Japan in government service in 1955. So there's Bud in 1955 in Japan. We don't like he's in Tokyo, Japan. That's it.
Not what he's doing specifically or anything more. Damn.
No. Harry Fukuhara, another MIS guy that we talked about earlier, he was also in Tokyo around the same time doing similar stuff. They were doing all kinds of interesting things, like the 441st CIC and other agents, because they were like cultivating informants in like communist and anarchist and old, but like ultra nationalist groups. They were interrogating POWs from like Soviet gulags who were getting repatriated to Japan, like almost 10 years after the end of the war. Like my aunt's father was like in a Soviet gulag well into the 50s. And then he got repatriated to Hokkaido. And so, yeah, just intriguing. And then in 1970, Bud Mukaye marries somebody. And it's about a month after his dad dies too. He marries a woman named Yukiko, who was the widow of a Navy sailor who died in a car crash in Virginia. And that's her only kind of reference in America as far as I've been able to find. And then she, there's no, and so he's married in Vegas in 1970 to Yukiko.
He was born in what was it, 1915?
Yeah. So
he's in his 50s or so by that point.
Yeah. He's like 55, and that's the first marriage record I see. And then in 1975, February of 1975, Bud dies. He's 60, just turned 60, and he dies, and he's buried in LA, and he's survived by his wife Yukiko, and that's it. That's it. And that's it that I've been able to find so far. There's got to be more, because it's just so like terribly mysterious.
Yeah, like there's, I mean, I'm picturing like the end of Shawshank Redemption, where they escape to just I had to look it up, Zihuatanejo. I never would have gotten that. But it's the place that symbolizes like we're free, we're there, they're making boats or something, right? Or am I mixing up my movie references? But like just somewhere peaceful, found his spot. Maybe he made boats or whatever. But like, if you're just being you, you're not going to end up in a newspaper or something generally.
Yeah.
But people know you, right?
But is that the Bud we've known so far?
It isn't.
Like, can you imagine Bud just fading away?
Right.
And doing nothing? There's nothing about Bud, like, until 1945 that says that.
Yeah.
We all get tired, though.
Yeah. Well, and so that's the thing, right? Is like, he saw some stuff.
Yeah.
Right? Like, he saw some stuff. Like, it could have changed him. Right?
Yeah.
The other is there's also people who were in his class, like Grant Ichikawa, who, after he was in Vietnam, he joined the CIA and he served in the Far East in the CIA as a CIA officer and like Grant Ichikawa was one of the last people to leave Saigon as a CIA officer, like evacuating at the end of, the Vietnam War. And then he couldn't talk about that for decades. And I don't know, and Bud died in 1975.
So are you pushing Bud as a sumo wrestling secret agent?
I don't know.
Double O Mawashi?
It's definitely one of the most appealing alternate history ideas here, right? Like,
but it is totally speculation, and I know that.
Oh yeah.
He could have, gone to LA and become a garbage collector, and like gone to the VFW hall, and like I don't know, right?
Yeah.
No.
I don't know. If he did become a secret agent, like, if he was with like the CIA or whatever in the 50s and 60s and 70s, maybe I don't want to know what he was up to. CIA did a lot of bad shit during that time.
Yeah.
But like Project Midnight Climax.
Yeah, how many democratically elected socialist governments did Bud overthrow? What was he really doing? But I don't know. It's one explanation that would explain why there's nothing. If he did continue in the military, like, but we also don't really have records of it. So like maybe I don't know.
Yeah, I really don't.
Or he just ran a fabric shop and made mawashis for the local kids doing sumo. I don't know. Like, it could be like almost everything is on the table.
Yeah. Well, and he could have like maybe used his connections to settle it and just live in Japan for a long time. So I'm just not finding the records because they're in Japan. Like, there's all kinds of possible explanations.
Mm-hmm.
I just right now I don't know. I'm not going to give up. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not going to give up. There's still, I'm terrible with math. 24 years after this record of like, we know what he was doing in Japan in 1951, and then he dies in 1975. Like, that's 24 years based on how he lived the first, 30 years of his life.
Seems like he'd get up to something or other that would be notable. Yeah. So for just for context, how long have you been doing research on this project at this point, Nathan?
Oh, thank you. I appreciate you helping me make excuses for why I don't know some things. 4 months.
4 months. Okay.
Or 3.5, something like that. 3.5, 4 months.
Sure.
So like, again, still just scratching the surface. Just scratching the surface, but learned so much. And I just love that, I'm finding stuff and looking at stuff that apparently nobody else has, or a few people have talked about, but, collecting them all together.
Easier if he had children to find out.
So I don't know. I think so, because it doesn't look like he had children, and his sister didn't have children. His sister,
I was going to ask about siblings.
Yeah, no nephews or nieces. His sister likewise seems to either not married or at least not had children. And she died fairly young. She died in the late 50s, I think, when she was still in her 40s or something. She was quite a bit older than Bud. So yeah, there's no like nephews or nieces. There's nothing. No descendants. I think maybe if he had children. But what's interesting is some of these sumo stories the sumo stories are almost being passed down by the people themselves, like especially in the 90s when like Japanese American National Museum was kind of pushing like let's preserve things and get things donated, and they had an exhibit. um and a lot of the donors were either the children or directly the people who donated it, especially in Northern California, donated the items. So it's hard to tell, and I do want to connect with, and if anybody's watching, if you're descendants of any of these characters, if you know anything more about them, we do want to know and flesh them out, because we know we're finding tidbits, we're finding stories, we're finding a narrative in a thread, but like I said earlier, we don't really know the people. Like, it's an interesting story and it's a window and to tell stories, but to humanize them a bit more would be great. I would love that.
We're coming from an era where there really isn't there isn't nearly like there's orders of magnitude less stuff, less data, less things written down. It's all like newspapers or whatever. Like there's no social media, there's no like if you happened across like a diary or something, that would be like the closest thing you could get to actually getting to know people. There's no podcasts where you get to hang out for people for hours and hours at a time. And what does that look supposed to mean?
I don't know.
Oh,
I feel like he found a diary.
Yeah, he's giving me a look like maybe
Bud.
I
Did
have
you find
something.
Bud's diary?
Not a Bud diary, but there is a diary, and I even have new stuff that I haven't told you about, JJ.
Wow. All right. I think that this is a great spot to end the episode. We dive deep into Bud Mukaye's story. This is a two-parter, so if you only saw this one, you kind of spoiled yourself for the first one. But
if you want to sit through that first one knowing that we don't know anything about the last 25 years of the guy's life, go for it.
But there are some good stuff that happened earlier, some more like super interesting, right?
And sumo related.
Yeah. And just know that, this is a sumo history podcast, and it's not political, but echoes of the past are living in our future. And it seems like there is just a playbook on people conquering people and oppressing people. But that is a story, hopefully, that will stay in the past. Thank you and good night. Bye.
Ha